Yeah. For Steely Dan's Royal Scam album, I had just, I was doing some rhythm arrangements in LA.
Known for their ruthless pursuit of perfection in the studio, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen pushed every musician who entered their orbit to the very edge of sanity. Among the most respected guitarists to endure that crucible was Larry Carlton, a player whose touch helped shape some of Steely Dan's most iconic recordings, yet who rarely spoke publicly about what really went on behind those locked studio doors. Now, at 77, Carlton has broken his silence. What did he endure in those sessions? What secrets about Steely Dan has he kept hidden all these years? Larry Carlton wasn't just another session musician. He was a prodigy whose guitar tone could melt into a track and make it shimmer with life. Born in Torrance, California in 1948, he began playing guitar at the age of 6, inspired by the sounds of jazz greats like Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery. By his teenage years, he had already developed a reputation as a player who could adapt to any style, whether it was bebop, blues, or rock. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Carlton had become a first-call guitarist for Los Angeles recording studios. He played on albums by Joni Mitchell, Michael Jackson, Quincy Jones, and countless others. But his true reputation as a guitarist's guitarist came from his uncanny ability to improvise melodic lines on the spot. Lines so clean, so emotional, that they sounded as though they had been written into the song from its inception. It was this reputation that eventually led Steely Dan to his doorstep. At the time, Becker and Fagen had begun to rely heavily on session players, searching relentlessly for musicians who could meet their impossible standards. They didn't want players who simply followed directions. They wanted musicians who could offer something extraordinary under crushing pressure. Carlton fit the bill perfectly, but stepping into the world of Steely Dan was not like any other gig. In the controlled chaos of their sessions, musicians were often summoned at odd hours, asked to play a part dozens of times, only to find their work discarded by the next day. Many players walked away frustrated, their egos bruised. Carlton, however, had the patience and the temperament to endure it. He knew he was walking into a world where the spotlight wasn't meant to shine on him, but rather on the strange, brilliant machine that was Steely Dan. For years, his work remained hidden in plain sight, embedded in tracks that millions adored, but few could identify by player. He was the ghost in the grooves, the guitarist behind the curtain. And yet, the silence about what happened in those rooms would last for decades. Carlton didn't speak out, not because he couldn't, but because the code of the studio demanded discretion. Now, as he opens up, the curtain finally lifts. To understand why Larry Carlton's revelations matter, you have to understand Steely Dan's process. Becker and Fagen weren't like other band leaders. They weren't looking for good enough. They were obsessed with flawless execution, obsessed with tone, obsessed with the microscopic details most listeners would never consciously hear. Every song was a puzzle to them, and every musician was just another potential piece of that puzzle. Replaceable, interchangeable, disposable. In the mid-1970s, they had already abandoned the idea of being a traditional touring band. Instead, they retreated into the studio, creating albums like Katy Lied, The Royal Scam, and Aja, each one a temple of sonic perfection. They would book the best studios in Los Angeles and New York, hire a rotating cast of the finest session players alive, and push them until the music matched the sound in their heads. This obsession often meant recording dozens, sometimes hundreds, of takes of the same part. Guitar solos, drum fills, even single piano chords were subject to endless scrutiny. Carlton recalled how a simple phrase could be stretched into an all-night ordeal. Musicians were flown in from across the country, only to have their parts erased the next day when Becker and Fagen found someone else who could deliver the elusive feel they wanted. But the irony was that this relentless search for perfection often produced moments of pure magic. Carlton himself contributed to one of Steely Dan's most celebrated recordings, the searing guitar solo on Kid Charlemagne from the Royal Scam. That solo wasn't written, it was improvised, a spontaneous outpouring of Carlton's skill and instinct. Yet even that came after countless retakes, endless direction, and a kind of psychological pressure that only a select few could survive. Musicians described the sessions as both exhilarating and brutal. Some likened it to working under a dictator. Others saw it as being part of a genius experiment. Carlton, for his part, walked a fine line. He respected the artistry of Becker and Fagen, but he also saw firsthand how their obsession left scars on the musicians they used and discarded. The atmosphere in the studio was tense, almost sacred. Becker and Fagen rarely raised their voices, but their quiet dissatisfaction could devastate a musician more than any outburst. A nod of disapproval, a sigh, or a simple, "let's try it again," could reduce even the most confident player to self-doubt. Carlton endured it, but he never forgot it. Decades later, as he opens up, he speaks not just of the music that emerged, but of the price paid to create it. The sleepless nights, the broken egos, the sense that every note had to be fought for. Larry Carlton had already built a successful career by the mid-1970s, but the call from Steely Dan's camp was unlike any other. At first, it seemed like just another session gig, another day, another paycheck. But as he walked into the studio for the first time with Becker and Fagen, he realized this was no ordinary assignment. The air was thick with tension. Engineers whispered instructions, tape reels spun endlessly, and musicians sat waiting for their moment to be summoned. When Carlton plugged in his Gibson ES-335, he felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. Becker and Fagen didn't waste words. They simply played him the track, outlined what they wanted, a solo that was sharp but soulful, technical but human, and then left him to it. What followed was hours of playing, take after take, each one dissected, analyzed, and judged with surgical precision. Carlton later admitted that in those moments, he questioned whether he was good enough, despite his years of experience. Steely Dan had a way of making even the best musicians doubt themselves. But then came the breakthrough. On what would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of his career, Carlton delivered the solo for Kid Charlemagne. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rehearsed, it was pure instinct, born from years of playing, from his jazz roots, from his ability to channel emotion through 6 strings. When the final note hung in the air, even Becker and Fagen were silent. The take was perfect. That solo would become legendary, often cited as one of the greatest guitar solos ever recorded. For Carlton, it was both a triumph and a burden. The world heard brilliance. He remembered the pressure, the doubt, the endless hours that led up to it. The call that had seemed like just another gig changed his life forever. It elevated his reputation, cemented his place in music history, and tied his name to Steely Dan in a way he could never escape. But it also tied him to the darkness of those sessions, the relentless demand for perfection, and the memories of musicians who didn't survive the experience with their confidence intact. For decades, Carlton kept those memories to himself. He let the music speak while he stayed silent. But silence has a weight of its own, and at 77, Larry Carlton finally decided it was time to tell the truth about what really happened when the tape was rolling, and Steely Dan was chasing their impossible sound. For those who worked with Steely Dan, there was one universal truth. No note, no phrase, no solo was ever good enough. Becker and Fagen were infamous for pushing their musicians to the breaking point, demanding not just technical mastery, but a kind of transcendent performance that most people didn't even believe was possible. Larry Carlton found himself thrust directly into this crucible. The recording sessions were marathons. Days bled into nights, and nights into dawn. Musicians often stumbled out of the studio bleary-eyed, unsure if they had contributed brilliance to a masterpiece or if their entire night's work had already been erased. Becker and Fagen would cycle through guitarists, drummers, pianists, even entire horn sections, searching for the feel they wanted. A quality that could never be defined, but was instantly recognized when it happened. Carlton remembered sitting in the control room, watching as other players tried and failed to satisfy the duo. Sometimes a part was replayed 100 times. Sometimes Becker and Fagen would scrap the entire track and rebuild it from scratch, simply because the mood wasn't right. And always, the musicians paid the price: exhaustion, self-doubt, frayed tempers. For Carlton, the process was both exhilarating and brutal. On one hand, it demanded that he dig deeper into his artistry than he ever had before. On the other, it left him with scars, an understanding that the pursuit of perfection could strip away joy and replace it with obsession. He recalled one session where the band worked on a single guitar line for nearly 12 hours straight. By the end, Carlton's fingers ached, his calluses raw. Yet Becker and Fagen weren't satisfied. "Try it again, but softer," one would say. "No, sharper," the other would add. "More space between the notes." Each direction contradicted the last, but Carlton kept playing, knowing that one take might finally unlock the magic. The irony was that Becker and Fagen weren't virtuoso instrumentalists themselves. They were thinkers, architects, visionaries. They didn't need to play the parts. They needed to hear them played to perfection. And Carlton, patient, skilled, and unflappable, was one of the few who could endure their gauntlet without walking out. Still, the toll was undeniable. Many musicians swore off Steely Dan entirely after a single session. Carlton never spoke ill of them publicly, but he admitted privately that their pursuit of perfection came at a cost. It drained people. It broke people. It turned what should have been joyful creation into a kind of war. For Carlton, perfection was no longer just a musical goal. It became a haunting memory. Every time fans praised his solo on Kid Charlemagne, he thought not of the brilliance captured on tape, but of the blood, sweat, and doubt that had birthed it. Steely Dan's music may have sounded effortless, but it was built on the backs of musicians pushed far past their limits. Among the many stories whispered about Steely Dan's recording process, one session stood out, a night that became infamous among musicians, though it was rarely discussed outside those circles. Carlton was there, and for decades, he kept his recollections to himself. Now, at 77, he finally admits just how strange and unsettling that night had been. It was during the recording of Aya, an album that would become Steely Dan's masterpiece. The track was nearly complete, but Becker and Fagen weren't satisfied with the guitar parts. They wanted something elusive, not just technically brilliant, but imbued with a strange kind of emotional detachment. Carlton was summoned to the studio in the middle of the night. When he arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The studio lights were dim, the air thick with smoke. Becker and Fagen sat in the control room, their faces lit by the glow of the mixing board. They hardly spoke, except to murmur instructions through the talkback mic. Carlton played take after take, each one precise, each one different, but nothing seemed to please them. Hours stretched on. At one point, Carlton asked what they wanted specifically. Fagen leaned into the mic and said, "We'll know when we hear it." Becker added, "Keep going." The repetition became hypnotic. Carlton played until his hands felt like they weren't his own, until the notes blurred into one another. At around 4 in the morning, something strange happened. Carlton later described it as a kind of out-of-body experience. He wasn't thinking, wasn't even consciously playing anymore. His fingers moved on their own, chasing something deeper than technique. When he finished, there was silence. Through the glass, he saw Becker and Fagen exchange a look. Then Becker pressed the button and said, "That's it." No praise, no applause, just a simple acknowledgement that he had finally given them what they wanted. That take made the record. Fans hailed it as genius, as the sound of effortless mastery. But Carlton remembered it differently. He remembered the exhaustion, the mental strain, the eerie sensation that he had been pushed beyond himself into a place where the music wasn't played, but dragged out of him. The infamous session became a legend among the musicians who worked with Steely Dan. Some admired the duo's persistence, their refusal to settle for anything less than perfection. Others saw it as cruelty, a form of manipulation that broke down musicians until they weren't themselves anymore. For Carlton, it was both. He delivered greatness, yes, but at a cost he never fully admitted until now. The night of that session haunted him, a reminder that genius and madness often walk hand in hand. From the outside, Steely Dan seemed untouchable. Their albums topped charts, critics hailed their brilliance, and fans worshipped their polished sound. But inside the studio, fractures ran deep. Not just between Becker and Fagen and the musicians they cycled through, but within the duo themselves. Larry Carlton saw those cracks firsthand. Becker and Fagen were united by vision, but divided by temperament. Becker, brooding and acerbic, often seemed consumed by darker thoughts. Fagen, more outwardly composed, carried an intensity that could cut with a single glance. They worked in tandem like two surgeons, dissecting every take. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Carlton recalled moments when the two would argue for hours over a single chord change. Becker might insist on a harsher edge, while Fagen demanded something smoother, more detached. Musicians sat waiting, instruments in hand, as the duo debated in hushed but heated tones. Sometimes the argument ended with compromise. Other times, one would simply storm out, leaving the musicians stranded until tempers cooled. These fractures weren't confined to the control room. They bled into relationships with the musicians. Some players favored Becker's darker sensibilities. Others gravitated toward Fagen's precision. Carlton remained neutral, knowing that taking sides could mean exile from future sessions. Still, he couldn't ignore the way their dynamic created an environment of constant unease. The musicians themselves were equally fractured. Some thrived under the pressure, rising to meet the impossible demands. Others crumbled, their confidence shattered. Carlton watched friends and colleagues walk away from the studio broken, vowing never to return. He admired those who survived, but he also saw the toll it took. Careers derailed, reputations bruised, egos destroyed. The fractures extended beyond music. Rumors circulated about Becker's battles with addiction, about Fagen's struggles with isolation and control. Carlton didn't dwell on gossip, but he couldn't ignore the weariness etched into their faces. He saw men who were geniuses, yes, but also prisoners of their own perfectionism. By the late 1970s, these fractures had grown so deep that Steely Dan effectively stopped functioning as a band. They became a studio project, with Becker and Fagen at the center and a revolving door of musicians orbiting around them. Carlton understood why. The weight of their own expectations was crushing them from within. Looking back, Carlton sees those fractures as inevitable. You can't build an empire on obsession without it eventually collapsing under its own weight. The brilliance of Steely Dan came at a cost, not just to the musicians who played for them, but to Becker and Fagen themselves. Carlton, watching from the inside, knew the cracks were always there. It was only a matter of time before the world saw them too. Larry Carlton never set out to expose Steely Dan. For decades, he kept his head down, grateful for the opportunities, proud of the music, and respectful of the unspoken code of silence that surrounded the session world. But what he saw in those studios, he says now, was unlike anything else in his long career. It wasn't just the long hours or the endless retakes. Those were grueling, yes, but they were expected in the pursuit of perfection. What struck Carlton most was the psychological toll, the way Becker and Fagen could dismantle a musician without raising their voices. They didn't scream, they didn't threaten, they simply looked at you with quiet disappointment. Or worse, they dismissed you without explanation. One moment you were on the verge of contributing to a masterpiece, the next you were being ushered out the door, replaced by someone else. Carlton saw world-class players reduced to shadows of themselves. Drummers who had played stadiums left the studio convinced they couldn't keep time. Guitarists with reputations for fire and flair suddenly doubted whether they could even bend a note correctly. Becker and Fagen had a way of stripping musicians down to their rawest nerves, and then, occasionally, coaxing from them the performance of a lifetime. Carlton understood something others couldn't say out loud, that Steely Dan's genius was both creative and destructive. It created timeless music, but destroyed confidence, friendships, even lives. He remembered one bassist who, after being replaced 3 times in a single week, walked away from music altogether. Another musician, racked with self-doubt after a brutal session, fell into addiction. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns Carlton couldn't ignore. Yet Carlton himself endured. Perhaps it was his jazz background, his ability to treat music as fluid rather than fixed. Perhaps it was his temperament, his patience, his understanding that he wasn't just playing notes, he was helping to realize a vision. But even he wasn't immune to the toll. He carried the weight of those memories, the faces of colleagues who never recovered, the knowledge that behind the smooth perfection of Steely Dan's records lay broken pieces of human effort. When Carlton finally speaks now, he does so with both admiration and sorrow. He admits the brilliance of Becker and Fagen, the way they elevated music to an art form few could touch. But he also admits the darker side, that what the world celebrated as flawless albums came at a cost, hidden from the public. What he saw, what he lived through, could never be heard in the polished grooves of Aja or The Royal Scam. And that's the paradox Larry Carlton finally reveals. Steely Dan's music was beautiful, but its creation was anything but. When the 1980s dawned, Steely Dan dissolved into silence. Becker retreated to Hawaii, battling personal demons, while Fagen pursued a solo career. For many musicians, it was a relief. The cycle of endless takes, late-night sessions, and quiet psychological warfare had finally ended. But for Larry Carlton, the silence carried a different weight. By then, Carlton had carved out a thriving career beyond Steely Dan. His work as a solo artist and with bands like the Crusaders gave him both freedom and acclaim. Fans admired his smooth, fluid style, and his guitar became instantly recognizable. Yet no matter where he went, one shadow always followed: the ghost of Steely Dan. Journalists, fans, even fellow musicians asked about the sessions. What was it like to work with Becker and Fagen? How did it feel to create those iconic solos? Carlton's answers were always careful, respectful, restrained. He stuck to safe phrases. It was a challenge. They knew what they wanted. I'm proud of the work. Never more. Behind those guarded words lay memories too complex to unpack. He had seen musicians broken, dreams crushed, tempers flared, and obsessions spiral out of control. But to reveal that truth, meant breaking the code of the session world. And so, for decades, he chose silence. Silence became its own burden. Carlton carried the knowledge that millions adored music that had been birthed through exhaustion and despair. He heard praise for solos that had cost him sleepless nights and physical pain. He watched as myths grew around Steely Dan, myths of perfection, of brilliance, of a band untouchable by flaws. And all the while, he knew the truth was messier, darker, and more human. There was also fear. Becker and Fagen commanded immense respect in the industry. To speak out against them could mean professional suicide, even for a guitarist of Carlton's caliber. Others had learned that lesson the hard way. Musicians who dared to criticize Steely Dan found themselves quietly blacklisted, their names absent from future sessions. Carlton wasn't willing to risk his career, his family, his livelihood, and so the silence stretched on, year after year, album after album. Steely Dan reunited in the 1990s, Becker and Fagen older, but no less exacting. Carlton watched from afar, knowing he would forever be linked to their legacy, but unwilling to step back into that world. Decades passed. Becker died in 2017, and Fagen carried the torch alone. The music endured, but the memories remained locked away. Until now. At 77, Larry Carlton has decided that silence is no longer necessary. He has lived long enough to see his own legacy secure, his reputation unshakable. And with that, security comes freedom. The freedom to finally tell the story the world has never heard. Why did Larry Carlton choose to break his silence after so many years? The answer lies in both legacy and mortality. At 77, he knows his time is finite. He has given the world decades of music, shaped countless sessions, and inspired generations of guitarists. But he also knows that his role in Steely Dan's story is too significant to remain unspoken. For Carlton, speaking now is not about revenge or bitterness. He still respects Becker and Fagen as artists, still acknowledges the genius in their music, but he also wants the world to understand the cost of that genius. Fans hear Aya and marvel at its polish. They hear the royal scam and celebrate its precision. Few stop to ask what it took to achieve those sounds. Carlton feels a responsibility to answer that question, to reveal the human struggle hidden behind the perfection. There is also a sense of healing in his decision. For years, he carried the weight of his memories alone, watching as myths hardened into legend. To finally speak is to release some of that burden. He can acknowledge the pain, the exhaustion, the sacrifices, without diminishing the brilliance of the music itself. Another reason is his audience. Carlton has spent a lifetime teaching, mentoring, and inspiring younger musicians. He wants them to know the truth, that artistry is not always glamorous, that genius can be destructive as well as inspiring, that the pursuit of perfection can both elevate and consume. His story is a cautionary tale as much as it is a confession. In interviews, Carlton admits he has nothing left to lose. His career is secure, his reputation beyond reproach. Speaking out will not tarnish his legacy, it will complete it. By opening up, he ensures that future generations will not only hear the music, but understand the reality behind it. Finally, there is the matter of justice. So many musicians were chewed up and discarded by Steely Dan's process, their names forgotten, their contributions erased. Carlton speaks for them too, for the bassist who quit music, for the drummer who never recovered, for the countless session players whose brilliance was lost in the endless pursuit of perfection. By telling the truth, he honors their struggles. At 77, Larry Carlton is no longer just the guitarist behind the curtain. He is the witness, the storyteller, the one who can finally give voice to what others could not say. And in doing so, he forces us to ask a haunting question. Can music be considered pure genius if it leaves broken lives in its wake? For decades, Steely Dan has been celebrated as one of the most sophisticated, meticulous, and uncompromising bands in rock history. Their music endures in pristine recordings that sound as flawless today as they did the day they were cut to vinyl. But Larry Carlton's testimony at 77 reframes that legacy. He doesn't diminish the brilliance of Becker and Fagen, far from it. Instead, he reveals the hidden cost of that brilliance, the shadows cast by its blinding light. The truth, Carlton insists, is that Steely Dan's perfection was not divine inspiration. It was human labor pushed to the brink. It was nights of exhaustion, egos bruised, and careers derailed. The beauty in their music came from chaos, from obsession, from a system that demanded everything and gave back little more than the chance to say, "Yes, that's my part on the record." Carlton looks back at Kid Charlemagne, the solo that changed his life, with mixed feelings. To the public, it's one of the greatest guitar solos of all time. To him, it's a reminder of hours of relentless takes, of questioning his own ability, of being broken down, and then somehow piecing himself back together in the moment. He acknowledges the genius of what came out of those sessions, but he also admits that genius often left destruction in its wake. The legacy of Steely Dan, then, is twofold. On one side, they left behind a catalog of music so perfect, so polished, that it remains untouchable in the pantheon of rock. On the other, they left a trail of stories of musicians pushed beyond their limits, stories of silence and fear, stories that until now were left untold. Carlton's revelations bridge those two sides, showing that genius and cruelty, brilliance and obsession can exist in the same room, in the same moment, in the same song. And yet, Carlton is not bitter. That's the most remarkable part of his confession. He doesn't look back with hatred or resentment. He looks back with clarity. He understands that Steely Dan was a product of its time, of two men who demanded everything in pursuit of their vision. He acknowledges the harm, but also the art. His truth is not about tearing down Becker and Fagen, it's about painting the full picture. For fans, this new perspective changes how we hear the music. The silky, smooth grooves of Aja now carry an undertone of human struggle. The dazzling solos of the Royal Scam echo with the exhaustion of the musicians who played them. The perfection we hear is no longer abstract. It is the sound of sweat, pain, and persistence etched into wax. In the end, Carlton's words force us to confront a difficult truth. Music history often celebrates the product while erasing the process. The world hears brilliance. The musicians remember the scars. And in telling his story, Larry Carlton ensures that those scars are no longer invisible. The truth about Steely Dan's legacy is not that they were flawless. It's that their flaws, their obsessions, their relentless drive created something greater than themselves. Something beautiful, yes, but also something haunting. Carlton's voice, steady after decades of silence, reminds us that behind every perfect note lies a very human story. Larry Carlton has finally broken his silence, and in doing so, he's reshaped how we see Steely Dan forever. Their music remains iconic, but the story behind it is now richer, darker, and more human than ever before. What do you think? Does the price of perfection change how you hear the songs? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from music's hidden corners.